It's a great honor to be here and to be kicking off this series, but I want to start first with a confession and then with a contention. My confession is that although the series is called Innovators in Action, and this is going to be a little bit more like an innovator in contemplation. There's a lot that I can say about my work, and it's created, I think, a lot of very interesting insights for me, the spectrum that Francis talked about, and I've worked on so many other issues, from quality end-of-life care to healthcare for marginalized populations, and creating a movement for community sport, and a movement for corporate citizenship, and so on. But the fact is that when Francis asked me to talk, I thought that, my life is really a dialogue with my work. And what I wanted to talk about, because what I find myself thinking about in dialogue with my work is change itself, and how change happens, and what actually change is, and why we want it, and how we might be able to understand it a little bit better so that we might be able to be more effective agents of change, particularly change in our own times, and what it is that we actually are trying to solve for, and what it is that we want, and what we're trying to do to bring it about. Change we can believe in, said Obama, but what do we actually believe in? So that's what I want to try to explore a little this evening. It's a new talk for me, an opportunity to try to give voice to some of the stuff that's going on in my head. I'm not sure exactly where this talk is going to go, so I ask for your patience if it goes off the rails a little bit. I should say that, when Francis talked about building a bridge to her and to McGill University, when I was working with DuPont Canada, who was my client, and what I had recommended to them was that they make their corporate citizenship cause social innovation. Now, social innovation wasn't the kind of buzzword that it is now. In fact, the term didn't really have much sense at all. But what I was interested in, and got them interested in, was this question of how we can have transformative effect. How we can bring about the kind of systems change that we need in a very complex world. And to their great credit, they said yes. Now, here's my contention. Well, so I just want to qualify one thing there. That when I'm talking about social innovation, I don't mean innovation for social organizations. I don't mean innovation in social programs. I don't mean social entrepreneurship. I don't mean the use of social media, although all of those things might be part of what's involved. I actually don't mean so much innovation in inputs as innovation in outcomes. It's the transformative effect that we are after, the thing that's so difficult to achieve but so urgently necessary. And that brings me to my starting contention, which is that we are at one of the inflection points of history. A great deal has to change, and necessarily will change. Whether we have some positive agency is what's at question. But this is one of the points in history when massive change is upon us. It is, I think, the challenge of the 21st century. For 200 years or so, society has become remarkably good at the challenge of making things. It's harnessed both natural resources and social energies, created competencies that are both scientific and technological and managerial, legal and educational and political, to make and distribute things, to create the modern economy. But my view is that going forward into the future, we're going to have to become at least as good at the challenge of making change. And that is going to require very deep new ways of understanding how the world works and how we can work on the world. In other words, a very deep paradigm shift, a shift in mindsets and skill sets, and a shift in culture, which when I started to work with DuPont is what I set up as our set of objectives. Can we create new mindsets or foster new mindsets, new skill sets, and a new culture for social innovation in Canada? If we are indeed at a transformational point in history, And if we are to have some degree of agency in that transformation, which would not, of course, be control of the future, but a creative role in helping to shape it, then we require, I believe, a transformation in our basic operating system for the 21st century. So I believe that we're not only at a hinge point in history, but we're living in a kind of with a kind of bipolar disorder. On the one hand, we have unprecedented ingenuity. We've accomplished so much, and it's demonstrated every day. The human capacity to invent and discover, all you have to do is to pull your cell phones out of your pockets, and you see what kind of transformation has happened in the last while. And so there's a sense that we can do anything. On the other hand, we're living with unprecedented challenges and a terrible sense of stuckness, of foreboding about what's to come and how we're going to cope. As though we're sitting on the Titanic in the greatest luxury and comfort imaginable, somehow knowing that catastrophe awaits us, and we are woefully ill-equipped, as they were on the Titanic, to prevent what is about to happen or to respond to it. Pass the champagne, please, and strike up the band. I don't want to think about it. That's how it feels sometimes. But I am most decidedly not here to prophesy doom and gloom. I am not a pessimist. I believe that the future is open. It is not ours to command, but we do have a role in shaping it. And at this particular point, when so much is hanging in the balance and so much is in motion, it is a time when our interventions can have a very significant effect. One final comment before I actually begin saying what I want to say, which is that Tad Homer Dixon's Ingenuity Gap was a work of seminal importance in framing the challenge we face for our future. In fact, my wife is his publisher, and I read the book in manuscript form, because I shared the bed with him for several weeks. And it was partially in response to Tad's book that I recommended this program on social innovation to DuPont. But in addition to an ingenuity gap, I'd also like to posit that we face a wisdom gap and a courage gap on our path forward. In other words, that the answers we need are not to be found just in our brains, but in our hearts and in our collective aspirations for a brighter future. We haven't got the solutions that we need to secure a better future. The best we can do is to foster the conditions in which those solutions can be born. So there's my argument in a nutshell. Now, I wish I could amplify it directly, but all I can do is offer a few insights that might be useful. And the way I hope to do that is by coming at them tangentially. So I've structured the remainder of my remarks into 3 sections, and these sections have titles. A Tale of Two Wolves, A Tale of Two Times, and A Tale of Two Cities. My Tale of Two Cities isn't quite as long as Dickens. A Tale of Two Wolves. This is a Cherokee parable. One evening, an old chief told his grandson about a battle that goes on inside people. He said, "My son, the battle is between two wolves inside us all. One is evil. It is anger, envy, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, resentment, bitterness, blame, and meanness. The other wolf is good. It is joy, love, hope, humility, generosity, empathy, courage, compassion, openness, and creativity." This is a sound challenge presentation. Always at the punchline. Okay, remember? Battle between two wolves that go on inside all of us. One is evil, it's got these bad qualities. One is good, it's got these good qualities. The grandson thought for a minute, and then asked his grandfather, "Grandfather, which wolf wins?" And the old Cherokee replied simply, "The one you feed." It seems to me this is a very apt parable for our times. It is central to the challenge of social innovation, and it is a crucial question we should all be asking. Which wolf will we feed? Which will be the dominant characteristic of our organizations, our communities, our governments, our society, as we stand at this hinge point in history with so much being asked of us and so much hanging in the balance? cynicism, blame, and self-protection, or care, courage, and creativity. It is what it is, or it is not yet what it might be. A culture of complacency or a culture of possibility. Now, this culture is what I call maybe space. And to put my point simply, maybe space is the culture that we need to cultivate for real social innovation to be achieved in our time. It is the seedbed conditions we need to address the challenges for the changes we face. The qualities of maybe space, of a real culture for social innovation, are the qualities of the good wolf. Fundamentally, courage, creativity, hopefulness, bold imagination, openness to the future, and generosity of spirit. Now, you may think that maybe is a pretty tentative word to apply to the qualities I've listed and to my call for a profound spirit of possibility. But let me quote myself from the foreword that I wrote to Getting to Maybe. Maybe comes with no guarantees, only a chance. But maybe has always been the best odds the world has offered to those who set out to alter its course. Maybe is not a cautious word. It is a defiant claim of possibility in the face of a status quo we are unwilling to accept. And that's what I mean by maybe space. Now, by the way, I have the distinction of having a named maybe, Getting to Maybe. It was my title. In fact, I named it twice. The first title that I suggested was The Shock of the Possible. Remember that, Francis? But one of the co-authors thought that it sounded a little bit too much like George Bush's Shock and Awe. Oh well. When Francis and Cheryl asked me to talk, they asked me if I'd share a few watershed moments, so here's the first of them. The Shock of the Possible was a name that I gave to a campaign that I was working on many years ago for a coalition of Canadian organizations working in international development. I was working on the strategy, I was going over research, and it seemed to me, and I was writing out my strategy notes, and I said, you know, we have shocked people for so long with a sense of the problem, it is time to shock them with a sense of the possible. And I looked at those words, the shock of the possible, and I said, that's it. That's the campaign. The shock, to me, was that no one that I spoke to in the international development community could name anything that was possible. I talked to leader after leader of these development organizations, and they said, what's possible? And not one of them could say anything that was possible. And this, by the way, was at the time of Muhammad Yunus and the microcredit revolution was just on the rise. But in that culture, you can see, none of them were capable of entering maybe space. They were in a trap. They were trapped in a view of the problem. I think it justified their existence. I'm not being kind to them. But a sense of possibility, it seems to me. And they wanted, this is the thing, they also wanted a campaign because they wanted the Canadian public to share that view of how bad things were. Now, we all know that there are terrible problems of poverty. But it's a sense of possibility, it seemed to me, was the thing that created the moral imperative to act and to care. If nothing could be done, if the problem was really intractable, intransigent, then there was nothing for us to do. It was a sense of possibility that, again, I thought gave the moral imperative to act. It seemed bizarre to me that these organizations were working with such fervor and a sense of righteousness in a culture that could embrace no sense of transformative possibility. They had careers that had gone on for long. They were very good people, very serious. And there's no question that they cared for the plight of others. But there was no sense of transformative possibility in that culture. And yet, over my years as a social marketer and social change agent, I've seen this pattern repeated over and over again. Whether the issue is the environment, social exclusion, violence against women, poverty, you name it. Those who had a day job working on these issues would so often come to me with a desire to convince the public of how bad the problem was. I always refused. Attention to problems may create a sense of urgency and even an appeal to our feelings for social justice. And it's effective and it's an effective and well-honed tactic for public fundraising. It touches our charitable spirit, but charity is very different from change, and I want to make that point very clearly. Charity is very different from change. And without a sort of sense of possibility, the idea that maybe, not with guarantees, but that maybe things could be very different, we remain locked into the status quo. I think that this is one of the most serious traps to social innovation that we've got. Now let me describe another watershed moment. One that's really etched in my brain. Many years ago, I was asked to come down to the States to work with a man named Ethan Ellis, who headed up something called the Developmental Disabilities Council for New Jersey. Ethan was a man with cerebral palsy, one of the smartest men and one of the toughest warriors I ever met. He was a prime mover in Americans for Disabilities Act. He crawled up steps of Congress on his knees. He was a fighter. And he cared very deeply to try to change things for people with developmental disabilities. He called me down to do some work with him. I must say that I think that I got much more from Ethan than he ever got from me, and he is still the guy that I have in my brain. And I don't like to say that to him because we like to spar with one another. But I called him up this summer and I said, Ethan, you're the guy I always think about when I'm thinking about the work that I'm doing. Anyway, we were in New Jersey, we had gone, Ethan had taken me to a hearing with legislators and families of people with developmental disabilities. It was a very successful hearing, and then we were driving through the night on the New Jersey Turnpike. Ethan in his brand new Honda, he was very badly palsied, and he smoked cigars. And the ashtray was open, and there was cigar ash everywhere, except in the ashtray. And he was speeding, and I said, Ethan, but actually his hand-eye coordination was amazing when he had his hand on the wheel. And as we were driving through the night, there was silence for a while, and then Ethan said to me, we can't get there from here. And I looked up at the road signs, I said, what do you mean? I thought we were going to your place. And he said, we can't get there from here, Rick. I'll tell you what I can't acknowledge in public, which is that on the lobbying front, the developmental disabilities community does very well. We know how to work with Democrats, we know how to work with Republicans. We get a pretty fair share of state appropriations for our issue. But we can't get there from here. I'll never forget that, because it sounded to me at first like a statement of defeat. But in fact, it was the opposite of a statement of defeat. It was a statement of defiance. Ethan said, Rick, it's not a statement of defeat, it's a statement of possibility. We need government support, and we can't, and I won't stop for a moment putting pressure on them. But we can't, and we must not get pinned down in that fight alone. Because it's a battle for inches. And we have to go farther than that. We have to work on multiple levels at once. He said if we took all of the money in the state coffers and applied it to the care of people with developmental disabilities, there still really wouldn't be sufficient money to bring about the changes that I want. And we need bigger changes than just those battles that we're good at. Ethan said, I don't know where the other battlefields are. He said, I can sense them, but they're not as evident, as concrete as the government one. They're in the fabric of society, in attitudes, and ignorance of the public, and responsiveness or lack of it of employers, and the potential of neighbors, and the fear of family members, and the vested interests of professional agencies. The whole system has to shift, he said. We have to work on different leverage points. We have to take the whole thing on. And I'm too damn old for progress. I want real change. I want to transform the system. We can't get there from here. Really is etched in my brain because it stands for me as the green light into the space that I call maybe space. Ethan stepped into maybe space because he had a bigger dream and refused to get trapped in a battle that he was good at, but knew in the end was a trap that would prevent the larger transformation he sought. He refused to give up hope and conviction that what he saw was right. He refused not to be bold. He didn't know exactly what to do, but he refused to let that stop him. He didn't need certainty. He was able to hold on to a bold sense of purpose, even when the road forward was not clear. And you know, that experience with Ethan that night, actually I've had similar experiences with other kinds of leaders, and it seems to me it's always at night. There was a native leader First Nations leader that I knew, stayed at my house a few months ago. A corporate leader I knew once over dinner and drinks. But a different kind of conversation starts to unfold. It's a conversation that feels a little more truthful, a little bit more exploratory, a little less certain, a little less political, a little less guarded, a little more poetic, philosophical, idealistic, adolescent. I don't know what to call it, but I'm sure that you've all sensed it when things just open up. And what do you hear or sense? Namely, that there is a larger possibility looming out there. It's hard to name that possibility. It's hard to see it. It can only be sensed by the rods, not the cones. If you know how you see at night, and your peripheral vision is good and your direct vision isn't. It's looming there, but it doesn't yet have a name, but it calls to us, this larger sense of possibility. Let down your guard, and there it is. There's some sense of history or future in the calling, a sense that in the midst of all that defines reality, current reality, all the hard facts of what is, there's something real beyond that current reality, a larger possibility. And I think that that is a dominant element of an element that we have to listen to if we're to enter into maybe space. Another watershed moment for me was with Francis when in the social innovation think tank that we organized. One of the folks that we brought up was a man named Jeffrey Brown. Now, who here has not read Getting to Maybe? I shouldn't have put up your hands. Well, the story is beautifully told in Getting to Maybe, and I'm only going to give you a very condensed version because it's not so much the story but the transformative effect and the insight that I want to draw out of it. Jeff Brown was a preacher in Boston at a time in the early 90s, I think it was. Wasn't it, Francis? Yeah. When the murder rate among African American youth in Boston was about the highest in North America. Do you know this story? Heard of it? There were kids, 13, 14, 15 years old, who were getting shot on average every other night, dying from gunshot wounds. The problem was severe and it was self-propelling. And then it came to a head when, one day, when there was a church service, a funeral, for one of the young boys who had been killed, there was a gunshot fired through the window. And then the church was raided by a gang of about 14 people who were after a rival gang member who was at the service mourning his friend. They chased him, they beat him savagely, they knifed him. He didn't die, thankfully. But this was a shock and outrage, shock and awe for the whole community. And Reverend Jeff Brown, whom we brought up to the Social Innovation think tank, this was the tipping point for him. Because he'd been preaching from his pulpit for months he was preaching peace. Our community shouldn't be like this. Boys shouldn't behave like that. But his preaching was doing no good. And Jeff didn't know what to do. He had no answers. But he stepped down from his pulpit, and he did a remarkable thing, I think, and a hugely courageous thing. He went out at night into the war zone, where these kids were, he and a group of other preachers, and they just hung out there, late at night. They didn't say anything, they just stood around, walked around. For 6 weeks they did this. Until slowly, the kids on the street, the gang kids, who were chasing one another, doing drive-by shootings, selling crack, using crack, running from the police, until the kids somehow came to feel that Jeff and his colleagues were people who didn't want anything bad for them, that they could be trusted. And that circle of trust started to grow. And then eventually some of the kids started to talk to Jeff and the other preachers. And wisely they not only talked, but they listened to preachers. They listened to the kids, and they held back their preaching instincts. And they just listened, and when they discovered, of course, that these are just kids. Embedded in a very complex system with its own rules, its own values, its own privileges, and its own penalties. A system that was very hard for the kids to extricate themselves from. The gangs were like families. But as the conversation opened and the trust grew, so did the opportunity for transformation. And eventually Jeff and the preachers formed something called the 10-Point Coalition, and they engaged communities' resources, and they built bridges to the police who had been so embattled with these kids, and they asked the kids, what do you want? The kids said, well, what we really want is just a safe place to hang out. So they convinced officials, and they opened up a school expecting that they get 100 kids one night. They got 1,000. And as this happened, more and more of the connections to the broader community were opened. Something remarkable happened. And what happened is that the murder rate fell. And for 2.5 years, I think there was only one kid who was murdered in Boston. The New York Times called this the Boston Miracle. And cities across the United States picked up the model and began to implement it there. I talked to Jeff Brown at the Social Innovation think tank when we brought him up. And in fact, interviewed him before we asked him to come up. And he said something amazing to me, and really truthful. He said, I know that we did something, but for 10 years I've been trying to figure out what exactly it was. I know we had an effect, but I can't really pinpoint where it happened. It wasn't a cause and an effect. It was a catalytic effect. And he said that he had a sense of something unfolding, of an emergence. Again, something that was hard to put his hands on, but it was almost like magic. But he wasn't the magician. It was the system that held the magic. The magic is in the medium. And this is the nature of complex systems. This is the nature of things that are not mechanical. That they are systems of embedded energy. And what Jeff did when he stepped into that maybe space was he harnessed the energy that was in the system through the power of trust, through the power of listening, through the power of connecting, until all of the connections that bound that system the way that it was started to flip. And all of those murders that were happening, one every second night, went to almost zero. I think it's a key point, and it's a key point about maybe space and about transformational change. Which I want to just repeat, is the magic is in the medium. There is something alchemical in what we're trying to do, transformation. I always felt when I started the social innovation work that we were after outcomes that were much larger than inputs. There wasn't enough money or muscle in the world to bring about the scale of change that we wanted. Were we crazy then to seek this kind of social change? Well, no, because history and experience shows us, if only we will look, that it is possible. And that sense of possibility, I think, is so incredibly important. That's why I refer to the shock of the possible and the refusal of all of those NGOs to hold on to a sense of possibility. Without a sense of possibility, and without a sense of the magic, transformative, alchemical magic of complex systems, we can't really begin the work that we need to do to change our society. And maybe space is where I believe all social innovation is born. For me, it's the seedbed. It is the place, if I were to write the advertisement for it, where nothing is certain and everything is possible. This is the way we have to enter possibility, not knowing but wanting, not telling but trusting, open to energies we cannot anticipate and cannot fathom. But something happens when we give up certainty, when we are prepared to live in a question, we start to see things in a very different way. And if social innovation requires anything, it requires that we see things in a different way. In the story of Jeff and in the story of Ethan I've told, there's a common lesson. Both of them fed the good wolf. But it's not just a question of goodness winning out, and I don't want to leave you with that. Good intentions, love, yes, that was a prime mover. But it was courage, not just love. It was the courage to prevail, the courage to dream of the possibility of transformative, preposterously large transformation when nobody else could believe it. The courage to hold on to that rather than onto the certainties of what to do. So while we would all feel that the good wolf makes sense, and all of us who seek a better world would feel that the good wolf is the wolf that's inside us, it's not that simple. The truth is that most of the time we are inclined to hold on to our certainties, to become adamant around a call to justice, and to call out the faults and failures of others, to identify enemies and barriers rather than hopes and possibilities. We're quick to go there because it feels so much more real. And our bold aspirations, our crazy ideas of some kind of transformative effect can seem so soft and so idealistic in the face of the hard realities of the status quo. The practical wins out over the possible. How am I doing for time? How long have I got? 20 minutes? Having asked the question of time, I now go into chapter 2, A Tale of Two Times. Where do we actually get the idea that we could change the world? First, I should just ask, did everybody here have a sense that the world can change? Just hold up your hands if you don't. Good. Kind of crowd. But where do we actually get this idea that we can change? Oh, I saw you. Where do we actually get this idea that we could change things and make the world better? Has it always been with us, or is it something new? I think it's an interesting question. And it's a question that I started thinking, but I had never thought about it before, but I read in an essay by the literary critic Lionel Trilling talking about when the license for the possibility of social hope was born. The license for the possibility of social hope. Wonderful phrase. Now, I'm Jewish, and in the Jewish religion, I'm not very good at practicing Jew, but there's a phrase we have, tikkun olam, it means to heal the world. And I think that all religions have a attention and care for those who are less fortunate. But there's a shift from that charitable view to a sense that we could actually work intentionally on social change. And my understanding, though I'm not a social historian, is that this was born in the Industrial Revolution. That Industrial Revolution that changed everything, that gave birth to the modern era, that let us harness human ingenuity to the resources of the earth to achieve unbelievable productive capacity. And as the Industrial Revolution was rising in England, and as progress was evident everywhere, so was society changing. Now, we've heard about, and we have images of the dark satanic mills of the Industrial Revolution. It's true, but as Peter Drucker and many others have pointed out, people moved from farms to those places to work. And economists have estimated that in a very short period of time there was a rise in living standards of probably somewhere between 10 to 15-fold increase in living standards. Doesn't mean that life was easy, but for many people it was a rise from subsistence and frequent starvation. And it was a rising tide that did lift all boats. And in the process, it shook up a lot of social moorings. The very hierarchical class structure of England, of course it's still some hierarchy, but it began to flatten out. That hierarchy that underpinned so much of English society and that saw a sort of direct line from God to king to lords to common men to animals. That began to change, and so did the sense of time begin to change, because in an agrarian world, time, the attention to time is mostly cyclical. But with the rise of the modern era, time began to move straight forward with this view of progress. And with all this progress on so many fronts, something else was born, and that is, as I said, namely that we could be intentional in relationship to social change, to improving social conditions. There was a really significant rise in a sense, first of all, of moral outrage, the novels of Dickens and so on, the sense, as things began to change, that the world was mutable, and if we could see progress in so many other fronts, then why could we not have change as well in the well-being of people? And it's this rise in the sense of optimism and the sense of efficacy and the spirit of improvement in the age and the faith in the possibility of improvement. It was intangible, but it was pervasive. Against this, of course, there were deeply entrenched class attitudes, even vested in the church, that, and these were the old attitudes, that the unfortunate were not undeserving of their misfortune, that this was God's will and the ordered working of the universe. That was the cause. And of course, the rise of industry was happy to exploit labor and place the value of that labor highly above the value of human dignity. And this created social tensions, and moral tensions and political tensions. But my point is that the rise of industrialism also gave this explosive rise to organized and intentional philanthropy and to social activism to address perceived social ills. Societies, as they were called, to help others, came to be really commonplace in English life. They just abounded. Now, it is worth noting that the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals preceded the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children by about 50 years. So, the English are a little bit weird when it comes to their horses and puppies. And I'm saying it also because I don't want to give the sense that, there was this absolutely pervasive feeling that we must do good for everybody, but just that the rise in industrial progress also gave rise to this license for the possibility of social hope and to deliberate work on on creating social well-being. Much of it was reformist and interested in the behavior of people and the moral behavior of people. But there was this, I don't know how to say it, a kind of cultural thickening of goodly people with a concern and a desire to help the less fortunate, a movement of the fortunate to help those who are less so. But this belief in social change and in intentional efforts to pursue it, this is a point that I want to make, was born in the age of the mechanical and the managerial. That was what, undergirded the Industrial Revolution, a sense of how the world worked. The world worked like a machine, and that we could make machines that could work on the world. And as labor started to move into, and machines were predictable, and machines could be broken down into their parts and reconstituted. And the managerial, well, you didn't really need managers on farms, but as labor moved, as farmers moved into cities and began to work in factories, you actually needed management competencies to organize that labor. So we have the birth of the managerial mindset and the birth of the mechanical mindset, I think, at a time that was congruent with the birth of our intentionality to work on social progress. And in the end, this gave rise, this growth in the number of societies, this social desire to work on helping to bring about social progress gave rise to a very large normalized, institutionalized, into no small degree professionalized sector of society that has the day job for working on making the world, or making communities, or making people, or making the planet better. That's what we have now. It's actually a significant part of our economy, and though we call it nonprofit, it is a very real economy that is bounded by sets of constraints and accountabilities, and undergirded by ideas of how the world works and how to work on the world, and with organizations that fight for their survival. And filled with very admirable people, and many of you are probably part of that sector and that economy. But I wonder sometimes if it is suited to meet the challenges of our present and the future. Because we're now at a crossroads. The Industrial Revolution was the birth of the modern world as we know it. And we both love and benefit from that world, and we despise it, for it was also the unwitting birth of our current dilemma. The fuel that enabled the phenomenal growth and transformation of the industrial era is now running out, and it's running riot in the Gulf. But while we can all hate BP and think about corporate greed, we have to remember that that oil is pumping for us. We are the end users of that. We can't separate ourselves. The modern world, unlike the machine world where you could work on things and fix things, we are part of that world. You can't tell the dancer from the dance, as Yeats said. And even more astonishing than the fact that we are running out of this fuel is the fact that it turns out we've not only harnessed the powers of nature, but also have had the ability to affect and alter nature. The miracle fuel of the modern age is not only getting rarer, but also more dangerous with every gallon that we consume. So we've had an impact of mythic proportions. I know a lot of people who work on climate change and they think, why don't people get it? But to really think about what we have to contend with. This notion that the beast, nature, that we had once tamed, is now prodded into action again and is a source of tremendous danger that could imperil all of our lives. My view is that climate change changes everything. Pretty much every system upon which our modern societies depend and upon which our modern habits have been formed. We have to abandon the fossil fuels that drove the growth of the modern era, but we are locked in to the systems that have grown around it. What systems? Well, cities, housing, transportation, food production and distribution, consumer markets, economies, lifestyles, even our identities. The kind of change climate change demands, both to prevent further damage, if we can, and to cope with the disruptive consequences that we will almost necessarily be confronted with in the coming years, requires a very deep transformation of our patterns of living. Now, there will be, I hope and expect, breakthrough technological solutions. And technology is at the heart of many kinds of social transformation. Just think about the digital revolution and how that's transformed so much of our lives. By the way, we don't experience it as a revolution. We experience it as a normative shift. Does anybody have a cigarette? I've only got 5 minutes? Oh, but the point is that our technology is not in any way going to allow us to keep on keeping on. We do need to bring about very serious change, but some of the people that I know who think that everything will be okay because we can get everybody's behavior to change, that the mass of humanity will suddenly become saints of constraint, I think is very wrong-headed. And for what it's worth, my belief is that trying to make the world better by trying to make better people is a faster path to hell than climate change. And you have only to look at the tyrannies of the 20th century to see that's true. What climate change really faces us with, I believe, besides the instrumental particularities of the challenge, is a classical human dilemma. a challenge of mythic proportion. It's an existential test. This is an exodus narrative, I think. An escape from the grips of one organizing system and a flight into a new land through a desert and years of uncertainty that will test us to the core, and we have no maps. And so we need to proceed. Well, it's unlike the industrial era in that we are, if the industrial era and the rise of social hope and work on social progress was goodly people working from their perch of relative privilege to help, mostly, to help others who are less fortunate. Here, we have a problem that is not outside us. If in the industrial era that work was to bring more and more people into the tent, and that really happened, now we're all inside the tent, and the tent poles are crumbling. And so we need to proceed into an uncertain future and grapple with unprecedented complexity and summon up courage, creativity, and the capacity to collaborate of the highest order. In other words, we have to venture into maybe space, and not with the mindset of the mechanical and the managerial. I'm not really sure that we're prepared to do this. Let me just give you a quote from a book by Joshua Ramo called The Age of the Unthinkable. And by the way, Joshua Ramo is the head of Henry Kissinger's geostrategy firm, so he's consulting to the largest companies and largest countries in the world. Quote, "We are entering a revolutionary age, and we are doing so with ideas, leaders, and institutions that are better suited for a world now several centuries behind us." I want to talk very briefly, because I don't have much time, about Berkeley and Bogota. I think that they provide instructive lessons and show us different directions that we can pursue for the future. The city of Berkeley in California in October 1991 suffered one of the most devastating and destructive wildfires in the history of the United States. Fire raged for 3 days. It reduced 3 square miles to ash. It destroyed 3,500 homes, 450 apartments, injured about 150 people, and killed 25. And it destroyed a very, very special community. This was a community that sometimes called itself the conscience of America. All good liberals, academics and professionals, social people with a social conscience and who pursued social action. And they lived in a community that was an exemplary place where the sweet pleasures of life were to be found in the relationships and in the interactions that that place permitted. The houses were modest, but they were lovely. There were lots of parks and winding roads with beautiful trees. It was really a kind of paradise for the people who lived there. And after the fire, as the residents began to get over the shock and convene and decide what they wanted to do, all they wanted, they said, all they wanted was to restore what they had lost. They wanted to restore the physical space that made the spirit of their community so strong. What they explicitly did not want was a community that I think was called Black Hawk, which is about 20 miles down the road, which is a gated community with great big monster homes, incredible sumptuary display, houses that have about 4,000 or 5,000 square feet, with their back to the community and their front on the golf course. It was just an image of America that they detested. Yet, that's exactly what they got. I read this story years ago in a Harper's Magazine article, and David Kirk, who wrote the article, said, quote, "It's as if after the eruption of Vesuvius, Pompeii had reinvented itself as Las Vegas." How did that happen? Because it wasn't that some terrible developer came in and bought the whole massive land and did his or her own development. It wasn't that at all. It didn't take much, and I think it shows complex adaptation at work. It seems that the residents did very well on their insurance claims, and 2 or 3 of them at first broke with the neighborhood associations that had been formed. And were working to sort of guide the development and the redevelopment and restoration of the neighborhood. And with fact checks in hand, they commissioned their own architects. They stopped talking to their fellows, their neighbors. And they began not to look at their own neighborhood, but where so many of us would look, onto the pages of magazines like Architectural Digest, where the image of the good life is so prevalent. Now you start to see how a culture and a society really work. So they're looking at these magazines and they're starting to get an appetite for the kind of houses that are there. They've got this money in their hands and they can afford it. And they say they looked at images of the good life instead of memories of the good life. And what the good life started to look like was homes with 5 or 6 bathrooms and 4,000 or 5,000 square feet and or more of living space and 3-car garages. And not only large homes, but homes that demanded to make a statement saying, I'm bigger and better than you. Homes that were designed to stand apart from rather than to be with the neighborhood. The article then goes on to talk about how the rebuilding undermined the cohesiveness of the neighborhood and showed that to the residents, quote, the idea of the public interest was meaningless and civic virtue beyond their lines of sight. As one of the people building these houses said, it's America, I can build what I want. He said that to a shocked and despairing neighbor. And so it went. Status competition had been set in motion, and one after another the monster homes went up, and an oasis of neighborhood civility was lost. They got their big brazen homes, but they lost so much more. Now compare this to the city of Bogota in Colombia, which around the same time, 15 or 20 years ago, was a city of 7 million inhabitants that was world-renowned for corrupt governance, urban chaos, and violent crime. It was one of the murder capitals of the world, one of the drug capitals of the world, and if the citizens weren't gunning one another down, they were running one another down with their cars because there was an epidemic of traffic fatalities. And of course, poverty and pollution were endemic. But under the leadership of 2 enlightened mayors, first a man named Antanas Mockus, and then a man named Enrique Peñalosa, Bogota has now become, over the last 15 or so years, a model for visionary politics, civic engagement, and progressive urban planning. They've reduced our murder rate by close to 70%, 75%. They've reduced our water usage by 40%. They've increased school enrollment by over 30%. They've implemented car-free days, created a world-class bus system, built 1,000 public parks, 300 kilometers of bike and footpaths, and over the next 10 years are planning to build 3,000 kilometers more. Their vision is to transform the city from a place for cars to a place for people, believing that hospitable public space is an essential ingredient for a safe, healthy, sustainable, and democratic society. And according to the United Nations, Bogota has emerged as a, quote, a model for transport and democracy for cities around the world. This phenomenon has come to be known as the Bogota experiment, and indeed, over the last 15 years, the city has been a laboratory for civic innovation and risk-taking approaches to major problems. It's really astonishing what's going on there. And while they've had a stunning effect on practical problems and a stunning impact on practical problems, the biggest change, in fact, might be psychological. I found a quote from Mayor Peñalosa from 2005. He said, quote, we've changed from a city that was almost despised by its inhabitants, where we were really hopeless and people thought that the worst thing that had happened to them in life was to have to live here in Bogota, into a city where people are proud to live, where they can have a dream and make that dream a reality. And Bogota is an example of exactly the kind of bold social innovation experiment, civic innovation experiment that I believe we need in the world. And I understand that Waterloo is embarking on its own watershed scenarios, and I think that's great. Place matters profoundly for our well-being in the 21st century, and this is something that we better take very seriously as we think about retooling our world. Excuse me. I thought I'd turn that off. Why that? I mean, I just didn't know that. That was Louise. It's the first time I've ever called her honey. It's usually darling. You know, we have to transform our world. We have to think about where we can look to make those transformations, and we have to think, I believe, with moral clarity about the kind of world that we want. And we have to use not only moral clarity, but some of our understanding about what makes a good life. This is what was lost in Berkeley and captured in Bogota. We have to make way more Bogotas and way fewer Berkeleys. It turns out that stuff that we know in our hearts is also validated by science, by people like Robert Putnam, if you know his work on social capital. The place matters absolutely profoundly to almost every dimension of our well-being that we would care for. It matters to our health and how long we live and how we get sick. It matters to our safety. It matters to crime rates. It matters to the well-being of our children and actually how they develop and how well they do at school. It matters to our ability to look after our aging parents or those who are in need. It matters to our resilience when we face life's challenges, and it matters profoundly to our happiness. These qualities are actually local. They're social. They are our social resources. And I don't know what kind of world we need to remake, but I know that we have to be taking these kind of things into consideration. It seems to me almost for sure that climate change will force a relocalization of the world. And so the remaking of our places to be sustainable and safe and happy-making, I think, is very important. I just want to cite one last thing, which is a very important new study that's come from CIFAR, the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, a study called Successful Societies. They actually set out a group of scientists, social scientists and others, to try to understand why some societies are more successful than others. And this notion of our social resources being crucial to our well-being is something that is revealed very vividly in this study. If you want to be well and happy, relatively successful in life, in ways that matter, your economic resources can only get you so far up the ladder. Your social resources are crucial. In health, we now know about as much about social capital and its benefits for health as we did when we knew about the perils of smoking. But one of the things that the Successful Society study found that I found so compelling, because I knew about this business of social connectedness and social capital, but the study also talked about something they called, quote, our collective imaginaries. It is not, in other words, it's not only the quality of our social connections that affect our well-being, it's also the sense of shared meaning and purpose that knits the community together. The shared narrative that subtly communicates what and who has value in the community, what it means to belong to the community, what can reasonably be expected in moral terms from others, even what is worthy of our hopes. In a very real way, these collective imaginaries tell us who we are. So you see, we not only inhabit a place, we also inhabit a narrative, all of us. And it seems that some narratives can be a lot healthier than others. So when you think about that, and then you think about the quote that I read from Mayor Peñalosa, about that shift in the idea of people in Bogota, about the place that they lived, and the quality of hope and possibility that was there, you can see how profound that is, and how much it must contribute to their well-being. The other thing about communities is it is not just for our well-being, but for our collective capacity to act. For this is where real social innovation is going to happen, real civic innovation, real maybe space. Maybe space is not a place of sides. We have come to feel that there is a battle between sides, between good and bad, between corporate interests, let's say, or venal or stupid politicians, and those of us who care for the good. We all care for the good. We just don't know how to create it. So we need to combine our energies, combine our creativities. We need somehow to find a way to get over the dividing lines, enter a maybe space where there are no sides, and pursue that with a bold sense of purpose. Now, in conclusion, I would like to just offer I've tried to, in my work and from this talk, I've tried to distill a set of principles to guide innovation for 21st century well-being. And I would like to share them with you. Very simple. Recognize complexity, accept uncertainty, embrace possibility, trust community, proceed with humanity. Thank you very much.